Hello, and thank you for joining part 2 of our Tools for Successful Stream Management Planning webinar series. Today we will be discussing merging science and stakeholder involvement to support river health and community needs. I'm your host, Abby Burke, the Western Rivers Program Lead for Audubon Rockies, a regional office of the National Audubon Society. It is my privilege to welcome and introduce to you our presenters today, Julie Baxter of Acclivity Associates and Seth Mason of Luttig Hydrological. Thank you both for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And for the audience, I would like to share with you a little bit about our presenters' backgrounds. Julie Baxter is a senior associate with Acclivity Associates and lives in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. She is a certified planner and floodplain manager with 13 years of experience assisting federal, state, and local governments in strategic planning, outreach and communications, and mitigation and resiliency planning. She enjoys developing stakeholder engagement and outreach activities to support highly technical projects. Her past experience includes serving as the program manager for the Natural Hazards Mitigation Planning Program for FEMA in Denver from 2009 through 2015. Prior to FEMA, Julie worked in the private sector as a project manager, as the communications specialist at the University of Colorado Natural Hazards Center, and as a GIS and natural resources specialist for the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife. Julie has a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from the University of Michigan and a Master's in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Oregon. Seth Mason is the principal hydrologist at Luttig Hydrological, a consulting firm based in Carbondale, Colorado. He received his Master's of Science in Land Resources and Environmental Sciences from Montana State University and his Bachelor of Arts degree in Environmental Studies from the University of Colorado Boulder. He specializes in hydrological modeling, stream characterization, deployment and operation of data collection and management systems, and development and coordination of water quality monitoring and assessment activities. Seth works extensively with city and county governments, federal agencies, and 501c3 organizations on a variety of watershed, land use, water quality, and water quantity issues. I'm sure you'll find today's webinar engaging and learn new tools for successful stream management planning. So let's get right to it since we have lots to present to you today. Julie, can we please advance one slide? Okay. Your audio lines have been muted since we have a large number of participants today. We will engage questions after the main presentation of today's webinar, so please use the chat feature on your screen to type your messages or questions directly to me, and you can do this throughout the session. So thanks again for joining, and let's dive in. Julie and Seth, when you're ready, please go ahead with today's session.
All right, hello. Thank you, Abby, for the introduction and for your work in coordinating these presentations. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you all for your interest and participation. So 2 weeks ago, we saw a presentation from Brad and Mark on the Stream Health Assessment Framework, which is a comprehensive assessment of river health using 10 variables of stream health along with many supporting sub-variables. And the output includes a score representing the degree of impairment of each of these on each of these variables, and as well as an overall score then for the stream reach. And so they described this framework and how it can be used in the context of stream management planning, and introduced this diagram, which we're calling the Starman. And Mark showed how the results of the stream health assessment, along with analysis of the causes of impairment, allows you to start evaluating alternative actions for improving conditions. And so Seth and I are going to start on the people needs part of this equation and discuss how to engage stakeholders and the public in the stream health assessment and in designing a collaborative process for identifying and prioritizing actions for implementation. So I went to graduate school for a planning degree several years ago, and in planning school, typically first semester you learn a concept called the rational model of planning. And so this is a systematic approach for recognizing a problem, assessing the existing conditions, the desired future conditions, and then identifying and prioritizing alternatives for implementation, and then you monitor the effectiveness of those actions and apply what you learn. And so it's intended as a long-term, comprehensive, and analytical approach to planning and decision-making. And it gets applied to all kinds of different planning projects for communities. It's particularly good for using scientifically obtained data to allow for informed decision-making. And so many of you have likely not known it was the rational model, but you've used this in your professional and your personal life. And so if you didn't know it then, now you know that you are being very rational. And so I don't know if the authors of the Colorado Water Plan knew about the rational planning model, but you can see it in the elements of the requirements for a stream management plan. And so especially these last 4 bullets, and that include assessing existing conditions and then identifying targets and values and goals and prioritizing alternative management strategies and then measuring your progress. And so I think this model incorporates some really critical and beneficial elements for stream management planning and can be a good starting point for you in designing your planning process. So if we customize the model to more common language for natural resources planning, it might look something like this. And so we have the assessing existing conditions in here, and this is your, so right here, this is your scientific foundation, where you really need to have an analytical framework. And so the stream health assessment framework that Brad and Mark presented is really a great approach here. So they cover this step well for us, and it's also a great framework for the monitoring step as well. And so their presentation, they presented the framework, and then they started to walk us through determining goals and targets and identifying alternative management actions. But they did it from a very, they're using a scientific analysis. And in that approach, I think you could get some very clear directions and answers about the best actions to improve river function. Move the railroad, duh. But these, rivers and plans, they're in the world of politics and property rights and water rights and multiple competing interests. And so a weakness of the rational model is it doesn't really adequately address stakeholder involvement. And so that's not really a step in the process, but instead it's really kind of the core, a central core that gets integrated throughout the steps. And also originally the model was laid out as a sequential linear steps, and now planners usually think of it as a cyclical process. So it's iterative, often even iterative within the steps, especially in this area, and it should be ongoing. And then lastly, usually there's some sort of catalyst that drives the planning process from the beginning, and this can help you define your purpose and scope. So Seth, I'm going to turn it over to Seth to talk a little bit more about the catalyst.
Thanks, Julie. Go ahead and take it over to the next slide. Okay. Great. So the catalyst really is the rallying cry that project proponents can point to as the motivation for doing any planning work, and can be used to encourage participation by a diverse group of stakeholders. Without the catalyst, without that rallying cry, it can be hard to bring a diverse group of people who are busy in their day-to-day lives with work and family, et cetera, together to undertake one of these comprehensive planning efforts, because they can take a lot of time, take a lot of energy. So we really look to the catalyst as being an important component of the planning effort itself. And the catalyst can come in many different forms. Some catalysts might be more proactive, or more forward-looking. A community may be interested in, for example, considering long-range effects of climate change on local water resources and how those may lead to changes in the way that water is used or can support aquatic life or riparian conditions, et cetera. These planning efforts, or the catalyst, may be more reactive. This is probably the more typical variety of catalysts. They're event-driven. They may be driven by regulatory action, listing of a stream reach on the 303D list, for example. They may be encouraged by language in the Colorado Water Plan. Or in the case of the graphic that you're seeing up on your screen, which was the case on the Crystal River, where I was engaged in some planning over the last few years. We had the severe drought in 2012, and coupled with the patterns of water use along the river itself that led to the near dry up of a pretty large river near Carbondale. That was a large visual impact, really changed the aesthetic of the landscape, and became the catalyst for stream management planning in that particular watershed. And we'll go ahead and hand it back off to you, Julie.
Okay. We move from catalyst now to defining purpose and scope. I mean, this probably seems like an obvious step, but it's really important. I think a danger I see in these stream management plans or risk is that it's getting pulled in so many different directions that the process loses focus. So, I mean, you have multiple interested parties with different interests. You have complex dynamic river systems with multiple independent variables, loads of data and reports and other planning efforts to sift through, and you have a limited time and budget. So without a defined clear scope that you can point back to, you could easily get overwhelmed and derailed at any step of the process. And so I think there's a real danger of analysis paralysis as well. And so here's a few questions to answer in the beginning. And you'll definitely need to answer these if you're submitting a grant application. You want to be ready to communicate these purpose objectives and to your partners and to boards and elected officials and to the public from the get-go. And so Steamboat Springs has just started a planning effort on the Yampa River. Its purpose is mainly to address flows, but if you tell anybody in town that you're working on a project in the Yampa River through town, they want to know what you're going to do about tubing. And so it's constantly a redirection that it's not actually about, this plan is not about tubing, because if it became about tubing, that would consume the whole thing. And so you want to be able to communicate your purpose clearly in a sentence or two. So whether that's about, it is an issue about addressing temperature for water quality, and then also objectives. What are the outcomes or the questions that'll be answered as part of this study? And so, that could be, if you're looking for locations for restoration projects to improve floodplain connectivity, but outlining your key objectives in the project. And then what's the scale, what's the study reach, and then also who's the entity who will be responsible for coordinating the development of the plan, and who will help maintain it and monitor it over time. And so it could be a local government or a watershed group. And so not only is clearly defined scope critical for time and budget and resources, but also for the ultimate utility of the plan. Because if it tries to be all things, it's likely going to be weak in the implementation strategy and more prone to sit on the shelf. And so defining the purpose and the objectives is also going to be how you develop the stakeholder engagement plan, and then you customize the stream health assessment framework to best meet your needs. Okay. So another early step then in your plan development process is involving stakeholders. I heard a news story earlier this year about how much organizational planning is taught to chefs in culinary school. And so before you begin to cook a meal, you do gather and arrange all your tools and your ingredients that you need. And it's common for a chef to do 6 hours of prep for a 3-hour dinner shift. So similarly, you need to spend time upfront developing a well-thought-out strategy for how you're engaging stakeholders. And don't let this be an afterthought or something you do halfway through the process, because you risk missing really important information and expertise. And you also risk that it could be seen that decisions are being made behind closed doors. So you risk the perceived legitimacy of the process. And another reason that chefs spend so much time on preparation is because resources are precious. Time, ingredients, first impressions. And so you want to use exactly what you need when you need it in an efficient and effective way. So you don't have a public meeting for the sake of having a public meeting because you have to. You have it for a very specific purpose at the appropriate point in time. So time, money, the community's attention, the engagement of your elected officials, these are all precious resources, and you don't want to waste them. You need to be strategic. And so here is an approach to developing a stakeholder engagement strategy. I think you should always start with why. Define your objectives for stakeholder engagement overall. And so it might be things like increasing the buy-in in the process and the plan, getting better data and information, identifying solutions with the most community support, improving education. But to define your objectives, and then you might consider your engagement in these 3 main tiers of the triangle here. And I'll explain those in a second. But for each tier, you want to ask, why, and then which organizations and individuals to include, when, so what milestones and the schedules that we need, where we need to have involvement, and then how, what are the methods of engagement. And so if we look at these 3 tiers, the advisory group, they will help guide all stages of the plan. So this represents your kind of major interest groups, those that are going to be have the authority to implement the actions, and whose buy-in is really critical to the success. And so this might be the planning team or steering committee that meet regularly to guide the plan, review findings from one task, advise execution of the next. And I'd recommend that you keep this group to no more than 10 or 12, because you really you need engagement and commitment, and you're going to need to move quickly through a lot of information and decisions. And your stakeholders, so these are other individuals and organizations affected by the plan. And then they may have information on a more specific topic, maybe subject matter experts, help represent different points of view, and they're important to involve because they can help you identify barriers to implementation. And so you could involve them. You may go to them to present at a board meeting or regular scheduled meeting that they already have, but you want to engage them in a specific way. You don't want to leave it so that they just hear about the plan somehow. And then lastly, you've got the public, your community members, and general public. And these, for the public, you want to make sure that you are offering an opportunity to provide input on the plan. This also might be an opportunity to improve education about river health. Might be an opportunity to address some alternative facts out there. And so you want to engage them when you have some real findings to present and you really need some feedback. And so you may decide not to have a public meeting until a little later in the process when you have some results of that the river health assessment back, and you are looking for some input on different types of strategies and solutions. But make sure that you still make them aware of the plan from the get-go, and that they have information about how and when they will be able to participate. And also, don't forget your elected officials. Make sure to keep them updated on the progress of the plan throughout the process, and they don't like surprises. And I would also just say, err on being inclusive, and don't make assumptions on who's got really great information or who's interested in being involved. And we have, here is an example for the city of Steamboat Springs in their stream management plan they've just started, and how they're thinking about their key categories of stakeholders. And so the city has put together an advisory committee that includes representatives of each of these kind of core groups who can help represent their interests and act as a liaison. And they help us decide what are the best ways to outreach and involve these other stakeholders in the groups. And the arrows just represent that it's a two-way communication. So we're not just looking to push information out, we're looking to get input. And that's a really important concept in your public involvement as well. So Abby, can you turn the presentation over to Seth now to talk a little bit about communication methods?
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. Okay, Seth, here you go.
Okay. All right, is the screen share working?
We are seeing the presenter mode. Great, looking good.
Okay. Okay, so once you clarify the planning purpose and scope and develop a stakeholder engagement plan, and in keeping with the rational planning model, you're ready to move on to the assessment of existing conditions. This is something that we spent a lot of time hearing about a couple weeks ago when Mark and Brad presented. The Stream Health Assessment Framework is a great way, a great framework for thinking about existing conditions. There are many ways to either go about applying the Stream Health Assessment Framework, or in developing or implementing another framework. They may involve collection and analysis of new data. It might involve review of existing literature. It might require reliance on expert opinion. But regardless of the selected approach, it's useful to structure the investigation and organize findings in a way that recognizes the interconnected nature of ecosystem structures and processes, and presents information in a distilled way that is easy for a non-technical audience to interpret. And that's one of the really nice things about these REACH report cards that the Stream Health Assessment Framework provides. Is this is information that any layperson can begin to understand and formulate thoughts, more complex and nuanced thoughts about how a system is behaving, which is important for later steps in the planning process. So I'd like to just start with some review of some of the different ways that you can go about collecting data, analyzing it, interpreting it, and then using it to populate some of these REACH report cards that Mark and Brad discussed. So these are some, the next couple slides are examples from the effort that we were engaged in on the Crystal River. You saw this graphic previously. This graphic is a given date in 2012 that shows the relative stream flow in the river as the width of the blue line, moving from upstream on the right side of the screen to downstream on the left side of the screen. The thickness of the yellow line is the in-stream flow rate in CFS relative to the flows in the river. And all of the orange dots are surface water diversion locations the size of the symbol corresponds to the size of the diversion. So you can see how water use and tributary inflows along this stream reach lead to you know, some significant flow depletions in the middle of the reach there above Carbondale. And then downstream, where you start to get some irrigation return flows, you actually see stream flows creeping back up. So these longitudinal changes in flow characteristics are related to surface water use, as we saw in the previous graphic. This is the same information organized a different way. We're moving from upstream on the left side of the graph to downstream on the right side of the graph. Tributary inflows and surface water diversions are noted in the blue and red arrows along the top. Stream flows are the dotted blue line, and then temperature, surface water temperature is indicated in the green, light blue, and orange lines. You begin to understand how stream flow, changes in stream flow longitudinally then relate to changes in water temperature, and you can compare these to the red line, the red vertical line, or excuse me, horizontal line toward the top of the graph, which is the temperature threshold for a healthy brown trout fishery. So you can start to see how surface water inflows, surface water diversions, surface water temperatures, and threshold conditions for aquatic life all relate to each other. And it's this kind of interdisciplinary characterization that is fundamental to the stream health assessment framework. This information can then be displayed both in the report card form that you saw Brad and Mark display a couple weeks back. What we've done in this graphic is actually aggregated a whole bunch of report cards from different reaches along a very long section of river. So this shows report cards created for 30 miles of river moving from the top of the graphic above Marble, Colorado to the bottom of the graphic down below Carbondale, with each of the state variables included in the report card indicated as different columns. This type of graphic helps you quickly, as a layperson, come to some conclusions about the types of state variables that might be impacted along a study reach or within a stream network, and the position of those impacts that may need the most attention. And that is how we, in fact, use this information on the crystal. One of the big takeaways here, and something that we learned in application of the stream health assessment framework on the crystal, was that these visualizations are really key. Distilling down as much technical information as you can into simple narratives and colorful graphics, it can be very helpful in establishing both credibility for yourself in the planning process and developing, probably more importantly, developing a shared understanding among stakeholders about the existing conditions. And that shared understanding is critical for the next phase of work, which is determining planning goals and targets. So these goals and targets, again, reflect on the assessment results, and they can be articulated in various ways. Some may be more subjective, and others may be more objective. In the simplest case, a group of stakeholders may rely on this form of the assessment results to develop planning goals. They may determine that one of their primary concerns is, for example, C rating on the flow regime. And they're not exactly sure what moving it to a B+ or an A means, but they're comfortable with the idea of a planning goal being changing that flow regime ranking from a C to a B+, or in the case of biota, from a C to an A. After you describe these goals in a kind of qualitative manner, you are probably going to benefit from doing the extra work to probably put some quantitative bounds on these planning goals in order to understand the viability of various options for achieving planning goals at later stages in the planning process, you need to be able to specify what it actually means to move from a C ranking to a B+ ranking. So while the stakeholder group may not have the technical capacity to do that, at some point you're likely going to need to do that. In some cases, you'll be able to rely on the previously applied assessment approach used to populate your stream health assessment framework. In others, you may need to alter the assessment methodology, and this may be the case where you've used a literature review almost exclusively to apply the stream health assessment framework and come to your conclusions regarding existing conditions. What you're seeing here, this graphic that I'm showing you, is an example of exactly that. Again, all the examples today are from the Crystal River. This is a visual representation of critical low flow conditions in a couple reaches of the Crystal River related to or displayed against the existing conditions. So what you're seeing here is a representation of an optimum low flow threshold described as the green line as a function of drought frequency, which is displayed along the bottom, moving from a severe drought, a 1 in 20 year drought on the left side of the graphic, to a less severe drought on the right side, and in fact all the way over here at the right we're in average conditions. And the existing condition, the existing flow threshold is measured by the mean 7-day annual minimum, is displayed as the dotted black line, and various degrees of risk to ecosystem function are displayed in the other color bars, moving toward greater risk in the warmer colors. So by kind of quantifying the components of the flow regime that you're interested in your particular reach of interest, you're then able to start discussing specific quantitative targets for use in evaluation of alternative actions later in the planning process. So in this case, as a group of stakeholders and technical personnel and planners, you may determine that you're comfortable planning around drought frequency of 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 years, and a window that works toward achieving some moderate benefit or a moderate degree of risk to ecosystem function. And that allows you to articulate some specific gaps in flow that can be used for evaluation of alternatives later on. Okay, so we've gone through the determination of goals and targets for our planning effort. We're now ready to move into the identification, the phase where we identify alternative management actions. This again is something that you want to do with stakeholders. This isn't something that you want to do in a vacuum. And at this point, we're identifying potential alternative management actions. The identification of the potential actions should include some discussion of opportunities present within the system. In the case displayed here, these opportunities are related to infrastructure and water use types and efficiencies. So you can, again, visualize this information in ways that are easy to understand and base decisions on for a layperson, and begin to have conversations about what it means to have most of the ditches within a diversion system in an online condition, for example, and whether or not that presents a particular type of opportunity for altering the system toward some planning, toward achievement of some planning goal. Identification of alternatives should also include a discussion of any constraints, any apparent constraints on action. In the case that we're showing here, we're displaying agricultural use shortages experienced by different users throughout a stream network across different year types as one basis for understanding constraints that may exist in a system. So you're seeing different surface water diversion systems lined up along the left column of the graphic here. Years are the columns across the top, and the different months in the irrigation system are the individual colors and heat, or the individual columns in the heat map. Users experience greater shortages as you move from the cooler colors to the warmer colors in the heat map. So you can use this to come to some pretty quick conclusions as a stakeholder group, as a decision-making body, about where you may be more or less constrained in your application of management alternatives. In this particular case, the Lost Basin ditch and the Mount Sopris ditch and the streams that they divert from are pretty heavily used, pretty heavily appropriated, and may present some particular constraints if you're looking to those areas for some flexibility in water use or water management. These discussions should help you develop a relatively narrow list of potential management alternatives that are worthy of further vetting. We think that the 5 basic strategies listed here in this graphic probably capture the diversity of actions worth exploring in most stream management planning efforts. Certainly not an exclusive list, but these are some kind of general categories of alternative actions that are probably pretty broadly applicable for these types of planning efforts. So water leasing, ditch lining, efficiency upgrades, reservoir development, and then channel design. Okay, so after you've gone through the effort to identify those alternative management actions with your stakeholder group, it's then time to get to the really hard work, which is the evaluation and prioritization of those actions in the final development of planning recommendations that will ultimately be implemented by that group of stakeholders. And this is where I think the rubber hits the road with stream management planning, and how it's different from just a basic assessment of the existing condition. You must begin with a fundamental recognition that in a stakeholder-guided process like the one called for in the water plan, success will probably reflect a compromise between the effectiveness of a given alternative at meeting planning goals, effectiveness being considered through kind of an ecosystem lens, and that alternative's feasibility from a socio-political, administrative, or economic point of view. The point raised in this graphic here is just that on a given stream reach, it's likely, although not always true, but it's likely that alternatives that are most effective at the highest effectiveness are likely not to be those associated with the highest degree of feasibility. If we're thinking about managing the flow regime, for instance, on a stream reach that's downstream from a reservoir, the most effective action may be to remove the impoundment and drain the reservoir. But for a whole lot of reasons that I probably don't need to discuss here, that is likely to be very infeasible for all of the reasons that we build reservoirs in the first place, all of the kind of human need reasons. So a lot of this part of the planning effort will involve this cost-benefit analysis that ultimately arrives at some consensus that represents a compromise between feasibility and effectiveness. Practically speaking, this means working to understand the impacts of and controls on any given alternative when considering surface water, groundwater hydrology, water administration, existing water use needs, and any of those ecosystem feedbacks that respond to changes in stream flow, for example, across space and through time. The outcomes from these evaluations are probably complex, and whether or not they help meet goals depends on those perspectives of time, spatial scale, frequency, magnitude, and duration of occurrence. And in communicating these kind of evaluation results to stakeholders, it again can be very helpful to rely on visuals to communicate complex and multidimensional data. Example visual here displays results from a particular alternative management strategy. This is a representation of habitat quality and extent, moving from upstream on the top of the graphic to downstream on the bottom of the graphic, and through time moving from left to right. The size and color of the circle represents something about the availability and quality of habitat. A larger redder circle means more low quality habitat, larger bluer circle means more high quality habitat. So again, a quick way to visually represent lots of complex data that can help people come away with quick interpretations of what an alternative management strategy means for a stream across space through time under different flow conditions. It's also important to visually characterize any results from the feasibility assessment that are quantitative that allow you to do this. This is a similar graphic to the one you saw before that displayed use shortages. This graphic, instead of displaying shortages, is displaying shortage reductions. So it shows how shortages are reduced by implementation of some particular management alternative. Because we're running short on time, I'm going to skip through these two slides and just move on to this discussion that if we come back to this graphic from the Stream Health Assessment Framework and consider this hypothetical planning goal of improving flow regime condition from a C to a B+, we may discover that after moving through the structured process we use to evaluate alternatives, the highest priority action, the one that represents the optimal balance between effectiveness and feasibility, may only achieve something like a B- ranking. And what this goes to show is that these sorts of outcomes and the complex nature of this structured approach needed to guide a stakeholder group to this point are really why stream management planning efforts and the recent focus on them by the state are so relevant and important for changing conditions on streams and rivers throughout Colorado. Julie, I'll let you jump back in here and add to that discussion and carry it on through to the end.
Great. So if this diagram is making your head spin a little bit, that's kind of our point. That the evaluation process is confusing, and in my experience, it's often the most complicated part of the planning process to get your arms around. It's where advisory teams spin their wheels a lot, and so you'll have to design a process that works for your individual plan and your stakeholders, and they're going to vary a lot. But there's some kind of key characteristics to keep in mind of a good evaluation process, and that's that you want to have a shared understanding of the existing conditions, so that scientific foundation that you're working from, that the criteria for evaluation is agreed upon. There's consensus on that, that you're considering, as Seth showed with the bubble diagrams, both the effectiveness of the action to achieve results, but also the real-world feasibility of it, that you're analyzing costs and benefits of each action, both qualitative and quantitative, and that you design a process that is representative of the stakeholders involved, and that's transparent and documentable. So you want something that you can look back at and see how decisions were made and who was involved. So Seth, if you go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so we finished that. Now, similar to planning in real life, we've used up all of our time and our effort before we got to implementation, monitoring, and adaptive management. So these, we kind of get to the developing the list of prioritized actions and have a really pretty plan, and then it's kind of these ugly ducklings over here that seem to always get the short shrift and not the attention that they really greatly deserve. So I hope that we change that with stream management planning. We could certainly do a whole other webinar on these topics. And so although there are usually a lot of benefits to just the collaborative process, but we also want to get actions, projects on the ground. So taking the time with the implementation strategy to really identify who's doing what and when, identifying short-term versus the long-term actions, which ones can be done with existing budgets versus which will require external funding. And having conversations with the planning team, your project team, right from the beginning about how can we structure this plan to be operational and to be useful. And so I challenge you to think about whether the classic sort of book report style static Word document is really the best vehicle. There's a lot of new communication tools these days, and how could we have a living, more interactive approach to the plan. And I think if we spent more time with the monitoring and evaluating progress and using what we learn, if we spent more time with that in the actual planning process instead of relegating it to a couple pages in the end, and if we laid that out in a more detailed, thoughtful approach, it would probably be one way to guarantee or to improve the plan's successful implementation and evolution over time. So with that, I think we want to turn it over to Nicole.
Great. Thank you, Julie and Seth. I would like to turn it over to Nicole Seltzer, the Colorado Science and Policy Manager for the River Network, to talk with you a few moments about the River Network's role in supporting stream management planning. So welcome, Nicole, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Abby. I appreciate that. I really appreciate Audubon and Seth and Julie giving me a few minutes to tell the webinar attendees about some new work that is going to be going on. We're just kicking it off to enlarge the pipeline of local coalitions that are interested, ready, and capable of undertaking stream management plans within the next 2 years. I think as you watch Seth and Julie's presentation, it's definitely a little bit overwhelming, I think, to think about the resources and expertise that goes into the development of a stream management plan. And what I'm finding in talking to community members who are interested in doing this kind of work is that even getting to the point where you have the ability to hire someone like Seth and Julie can be a really big challenge. And so River Network, in support with the Gates Family Foundation, the Nature Conservancy Colorado chapter, and the Colorado Water Conservation Board, is launching a 2-year project in order to help communities across Colorado put together the resources that they need in order to initiate a stream management plan process. Because I think the assumption is once you have a set of consultants on board and the funding in place, they can take it from there, but to get to that point can be difficult. And so River Network, very briefly, is a national nonprofit organization that's based in Boulder, and we exist to connect and strengthen organizations across the U.S. that are champions of clean and ample water for their communities. Over the next 2 years, River Network is going to have several tasks, so those are in front of you. We're going to be creating a repository and widely share lessons and best practices in initiating a stream management plan to help those interested to get a good head start. We'll be providing direct technical assistance and support to up to 3 coalitions in Colorado per year to initiate a stream management planning process, including stakeholder engagement processes, identifying goals and prioritizing desired outcomes, and fundraising for the matching funds. And we'll also be engaging the resources and tools of Colorado's NGO academic research and science experts to help meet the knowledge and capacity needs of local coalitions. So we are just kicking this off, as I mentioned. I'm going to make sure that everybody on the webinar has a chance to engage with this work in the near future. Abby has kindly said that she would make sure that once this work is ready to kick off, we'll give you guys all a heads up. But in the meantime, if you do have resources that you think would help others get to start basically on a stream management plan, I'm going to be creating a resource library, and so I would love to talk to you about those resources. And then secondly, if someone in your community or organization that you work for would like to be considered for capacity building assistance, you can just reach out to me directly, and my contact information is on the screen. Yeah, so that's all I have, and thanks, Abby, so much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure, Nicole. Thank you. Seth, could you advance one slide, please? We have a few moments now for some question and answers, and please, everybody be available for participating in the answer. We have a couple good questions that have come in so far. A couple folks had mentioned they wanted to know to what degree would you advise involving with, or have you interacted with the local basin roundtables when developing your stream management plans? So does anybody have some comments on that?
I can jump in. This is Seth. Quickly. The roundtables have been instrumental in I think every effort that I've been involved with to date. They were involved with the funding of the effort that we implemented on the Crystal River. So they were very interested in the outcomes, both from a financial stake and because it was something of a pilot project in this part of the Upper Colorado, at least. We're engaged in a project down on the San Miguel River, and the Southwest Basin Roundtable is, well, a subcommittee of that roundtable is a technical advisor for that planning effort. So they are involved, and then I'll let Julie talk about the Steamboat, the Yampa project that we're involved with up there, and the engagement that we've had with the roundtable. But they certainly have a place in these discussions as a kind of a regional voice in water management, voice and decision maker in water management issues.
Yes, so the upper, so the Yampa green, white, the roundtable actually helped to fund part of the Steamboat plan, and they're involved in our advisory committee, several members of the roundtable, and we also are, our advisory committee, when we're discussing opportunities and challenges of the plan, one point they really wanted to drive home is that we don't want to duplicate efforts of the roundtable. Instead, we want to enhance and build those and then offer good templates for them to apply elsewhere in the basin.
Great. Thank you very much for that insight. I've had several questions also come in about engaging the advisory group and stakeholders in the public. And so could you speak to any lessons learned when identifying your advisory group and communicating or interacting with your stakeholders or the public? And if you can also kind of fold in, can you speak to managing expectations of stakeholders and how this process could help?
Yeah, so I think managing expectations is huge, and that's the point in the defining, really defining your scope and getting some boundaries on it and being able to articulate what the plan is and what it isn't. I think in terms of lessons learned, I think that tidbit about just being inclusive and not necessarily knowing who's going to be a great advocate, or who's going to have good information, or who's going to want to be involved. And you may find that members of your advisory committee that have been in the community for a long time, there's a lot of preconceived notions and experience from the past. Well, nobody's going to show up to that type of event. So just be careful of that kind of information, and because you want to err on the side of being transparent and inclusive. And just know that there will be squeaky wheels, and you're gonna hit some roadblocks and have to adjust course a little bit.
I might jump in and just
add anything
as well
to that?
Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, that local knowledge and the relationships that local watershed groups or TU chapter members or water commissioners or whoever it is that's engaged with a given community in and around water issues are really critical to the success of these efforts. I think I can imagine that it would be extremely difficult to move through a process like this effectively, being a complete outsider to the community. And the example that I could imagine is a basin roundtable, thinking that there's a particular stream reach within a basin that should be ripe for stream management planning, hiring some consultants from the Front Range perhaps, and sending them out into western or southern Colorado to implement a stream management plan. I think that group would have a really hard time in achieving success without the folks like Nicole was talking about, the folks with the local, with the folks with the relationships in the place that have the capacity to engage with folks, to bring people together in a room, and really add that cohesion to the entire process that's necessary from the point of view of a planner for achieving success in the project.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I know that the stream management planning process and the state role is really just gaining momentum, but a few folks have asked about what a normal timeline might be for using this stream management planning development model that you presented today.
I can jump back in.
Yeah.
Maybe Julie too. In my experience, at least, it hasn't been shorter than a year, and in some cases it's been 2 years and almost 3 years in another. So it can take some time. It really depends, I think, on the information available at the early stages in the process for assessing existing condition, and then on the particular dynamics that present themselves in a given basin regarding the way that you interact with stakeholders and the timelines that you can interact with stakeholders along. It can be hard to get people in the room on the timelines that you think they need to be there, and you need to be sensitive to that, and that can take more time than you think.
Yeah, I'd say my instinct is that a year is the shortest amount of time as well. The planning model that we presented here, it's a time-consuming model. So.
And I think that time can be daunting. It can be daunting to think about spending an entire year implementing one planning process. But another way to think about it is that's the time that you're spending developing the relationships that you need to actually take a plan from a hard copy document on a desk to an implementation strategy and on through to actually getting some things done. So I don't think that length of time is necessarily one of the cons of these planning efforts. I think it's kind of necessary to its long-term success.
Great. Thank you. We do have time for just one more question. I've had several questions come in about the Crystal River with the master plan, and some of the questions are, did you use the Colorado Stream Health Assessment Framework for the REACH report cards? If so, what were any key lessons learned, including any shortcomings that you took away from that effort? And last but not least, is it possible to speak to the cost, the overall cost in developing the Crystal River stream management plan?
Sure. You might have to remind me of a couple of those questions as we go along, but we did use an earlier version of the Stream Health Assessment Framework that Mark and Brad developed, and Mark and Brad were involved in that project and actually helped implement that framework. It was very useful. That, you know, the nice thing about the framework itself is it doesn't specify any particular methodologies that you use to characterize those state variables, and that can be, you know, that flexibility is one of the most beneficial aspects of that model. But that flexibility also means that for some state variables, you ultimately have a lot more quantitative understanding of the kind of ranking or the assessment results than you do for others. And that at sometimes was hard to talk around or talk through with stakeholders, when you can speak very authoritatively to one or two state variables because there's a lot of quantitative information available to you regarding its condition at various locations in the watershed, where some others are based on expert opinion or, you know, very old or sparse data sets, and you're presenting it all together, and there isn't necessarily a clear way to communicate kind of certainty in data to stakeholders without some narrative addition to those report card results. So those are maybe a couple of the quick kind of insights to application of the stream health assessment framework on the crystal. The others were about costs, I believe. The crystal plan was not intended as a stream management plan from its outset, and took some twists and turns along the way, where there was initially a focus on watershed scale sediment modeling, you know, hill slope erosion and channel transport. The results of that kind of transitioned into some different thinking about what the issues in the crystal really were. So the budget for that effort, I'm not sure really reflects what people should expect to spend on a stream management plan. But that budget was about $250,000. We're engaged in a couple others right now that are closer to $90,000 to $100,000. Again, that's a 1 or 2 year planning effort involving one, 2, or 3 different consultants who are coming together to execute it. So there are some efficiencies that can be realized, particularly in locations where you have extensive data sets available to you, in locations where there's not a lot of data available and where the study area is particularly large. Of course, you can have some higher costs than in others.
Great. No, Seth, thank you very much. It's very insightful. Lots of folks trying to forecast budget and effort and timelines coming forward. So with that, we're just slightly over time. I want to thank both Julie and Seth for all of their work in preparing for this great webinar and for their work on behalf of rivers and streams across Colorado. I would like to also thank Nicole for her role with River Network and helping to coordinate successful support for stream management plans. And I'd like to extend an invitation to you, if you are not already a member of Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network, to join. It's a good way to stay informed on future webinars, collaborative engagement opportunities, volunteer on-the-ground wetland and riparian restoration projects, and much more. Lastly, thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us. We hope you found today's information useful. And as always, there's more to come. We hope you join us again soon, and have a great day.